Friends, welcome back to the next session in the Maranatha Global Bible Study. I trust that you're all enjoying it, that you're all edified. So we've gotten through Daniel chapter 7. Now we're going to jump into Daniel chapter 8. I'm going to cover most of the chapter in this session, and then Dalton's going to jump in and hit on the issue of the 2,300 evenings and mornings. What is this mysterious, cryptic measurement or riddle all about? What does it apply to? And that alone is really its own discussion in and of itself. So I think the best way to do this is really just to read through. I think I should probably read through most of the chapter. I'm just going to jump in and kind of go for it. And trust me, if you've been tracking at all with the things that I've been saying about Daniel chapter 8 over the past 5 years, stick around to the end, because I've been agonizing over this chapter for years, and I've really been digging in the past couple weeks since the first session, since the first installment of the Maranatha Global Bible Study. I've had some even changes of opinion and so forth, so make sure you stick around to the end, and we're going to get into that. Okay, so this is Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat, and right now I'm reading from the NIV. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In the vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam, and in the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal, verses 1 and 2. Okay, so it's most often agreed that Daniel was having a vision. He wasn't literally there in Susa. He was having a vision that he was there, but he was actually in Babylon. Okay, Babylon, again, is 50 miles south of modern-day Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. Susa is a city that was about 200 miles pretty much to the east, slightly south, in modern-day Iran. Okay, Elam was a province of Persia. Ancient Persia is modern-day Iran. Okay, so Elam was a province of Persia that was in the southwest. So today it would just be over the border of Iraq into Iran. Now Susa, the city, again 200 miles to the east roughly of Baghdad, it's still a city today in Iran called Shush. I mean, it's still there. Okay, so Daniel has a vision that he's over there in the province of Elam. And where he's having the vision is important because it relates to the vision that he's about to have. Verse 3, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns. Okay, so a ram, 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but it grew up later. These are the kind of details, by the way, that are so important. Listen, let me just say this. The book of Daniel has been attacked probably more than any other single book in the Bible. For the past well over 150 years, pushing 200 years now, critical higher scholarship, beginning with German higher critical scholarship and so forth, has just absolutely attacked the book of Daniel. The claim is that it was not written by Daniel. It was written by a Daniel pretender about 300 years after the real Daniel lived. Okay, so this dominates critical scholarship. What is critical scholarship? Basically unbelieving scholars, unbelieving Bible scholars that want to prove that the Bible is not actually the inspired Word of God, right? But this has, it's formed the study of the book of Daniel. Now, why has it been attacked? Why have scholars attacked it so strongly? Well, first of all, because Jesus refers to it multiple times. And the bottom line is, if Daniel, the book of Daniel, was not written by the real Daniel, then Jesus was wrong. The entire Bible falls apart. First of all, so it's a great way to undermine Jesus, to undermine the entire Bible. You take out Daniel, the whole thing falls apart. But even more so than that, I think there's a deeper spiritual reason. I believe the book of Daniel is the manual for the last days church, and it has some incredibly detailed, very specific prophecies that we need to be wrestling through together. We need to be gathering together around these passages. Daniel chapter 8 is one of these passages. Now again, I've talked previously about how the book of Daniel is written in chiastic structure. Okay, so it's like a mountain, let's say. Daniel 7 is really the pinnacle, the peak of the book of Daniel. And so with chiastic structure, when things are written in a chiastic structure, it begins by making a series of points which build up to the peak, and then on the way down from the peak, it reiterates those same points, but oftentimes it expands upon them. So the book of Daniel, think about this. The book of Daniel begins by portraying Daniel as a man of wisdom, of God-given wisdom for the hour that he was living in. And so in so many ways, these pagan kings are coming to him to seek his wisdom from the Lord. But it culminates, the book of Daniel culminates with references to the masculine, to those with understanding, to those with wisdom in the last days. So in the same way that Daniel was this man of wisdom, then at the end of the age, just before the return of Jesus, the scriptures say there will be people of wisdom that will give understanding to the many. They will communicate and help the many, again, understand this incredibly important prophetic manual for the end-time church. Not just the book of Daniel, but, the entire unfolding story. And so, again, it's an incredibly important book. And that's the reason, quite frankly, that Satan has gone after it so strong, because it's going to be one of the greatest weapons or tools, let's say, in our arsenal of understanding for the last days. So when you have details like this, you have a ram. And by the way, the ram, of course, represents a kingdom, an empire, in the same way that the beasts previously in chapter 7 represented empires. So also, we've got some new animals here, some new beasts, but they represent empires. And the details, such as the horns, most often the horns represent kings that come up out of this empire. And so details like this, that there are very long horns, one's longer than the other, and that's the one that grows up later. These are the type of specifics that we need to pay attention to, because the Lord is communicating important information here. And again, it's very specific. Verse 4, I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. Again, very specific directions. From Elam, from southern modern-day Iran, let's say, the ram is charging to the west, to the north, and to the south. No animal could stand against it. None could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it became great. This is just like, if you follow boxing, the new champ emerges, and he runs the gauntlet. He's beating everyone. He's undefeated. Nobody can stop this guy, until eventually someone comes along and stops that guy, right? And then no one can beat this guy. And this is really what we have here. He did as he pleased, and he became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat. So first we started with a ram, now we have a goat. A goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. So now from the region of the west, we've got a buck of the goats. A new buck comes along. Quite literally here, it's a male goat, a shaggy goat, buck of the goats, and he has a prominent horn between his eyes. Now, oftentimes, you go on the internet and you look for, you're looking for a picture of this to do a PowerPoint or something like that, and it's going to be portrayed as a unicorn goat, like a goat with this single pointy horn, like, the magic unicorn. And, I understand that because it says a singular or prominent horn. I imagine, however, that what Daniel actually saw was more like a deformed goat where one horn just didn't grow and the other one becomes real large, this type of thing. It's not just this, I don't know, for some reason that matters to me. But, I'm sure there are goats like that, right? Just, sometimes horns grow in strange, ingrown toenail type of thing. So it's probably not a perfect unicorn goat, but I always like to say unicorn goat because it helps embed the imagery into our minds, and that's what the Lord does. He loves to use object lessons and different things for our memory to help us, right? Okay, so we've got the unicorn goat, and it says that he crosses the whole earth without touching the ground. So he also can fly, which means that this unicorn goat is a super unicorn goat. It's like Superman, but it's a goat. It's a goat unicorn Superman goat. You will not forget that. It crossed the whole earth without touching the ground. Verse 6, it came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and it charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram, shattering its two horns. Okay, so again, the new champ is in town. He shatters the two leaders, the horns, the kings, if you will, that emerge up out of the ram. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great. Okay, and previously, the ram had become great. Now the goat becomes great. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. And in its place, four new horns, four prominent horns, grew up toward the four winds of heaven. So this prominent unicorn horn is broken off. Again, the prominent leader of this kingdom, represented by the goat, is broken off. Four new horns emerge toward the four winds of heaven. Remember that phrase. Four prominent horns toward the four winds of heaven. And previous it says this, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, that large horn was broken off, and then the four horns. Out of one of them, out of one of the quadrants, one of the sockets, however you want to say it, where these four horns were, out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but it grew in power to the south. Now again, very specific. It grew in power to the south, to the east, and toward the beautiful land. That's the land of Israel. It grew until it reached the host of heaven, and it threw down some of the starry host down to the earth, and it trampled on them. Now that language, the host of heaven, consistently throughout the scriptures of the stars, refers to angels, the inhabitants of heaven. So whoever this king is, this little horn, and again, we just looked at Daniel 7, the Antichrist there is referred to as the little horn. So anybody who's paying attention in the book of Daniel, they understand, oh, the little horn, there it is again. They would immediately assume that this would be the same little horn. The similarities there are too much. Now, what's interesting is many interpreters will actually say the little horn of Daniel 7 is the Antichrist, because they'll say he comes out of the Roman Empire, which, of course, they have this Roman interpretation of the fourth beast. I've argued for an Islamic identification of the fourth beast. But here's what's interesting. Because they begin with the Roman identification of the fourth beast, when they come here, their identification of the goat, which we'll see, is a Middle Eastern kingdom. They'll say, this little horn is not the Antichrist. This little horn is historical. The two little horns, they're not the same. This is an example of how the Roman presupposition and a determination to stick by that Roman Antichrist theory, so to speak, it forces some interpreters to twist Scripture for all intents and purposes in order to try to shoehorn, because they go, well, wait a minute, over here the little horn's coming out of the Middle East, and that doesn't work, and therefore they must be two different guys. That's the logic that you'll read it in the commentaries. They'll come right out and say, well, this one's Roman, this one's the Middle East. They can't be the same thing. If we understand that the Antichrist and his empire come out of the Middle East, then they all work together. They flow together perfectly. Okay, so this little horn, again, it starts small, it grows in power to the south, to the east, to the beautiful land, and it grew up to reach the host of heaven. Again, the host of heaven, this is something that no historical king alone could do. This is something much more than any historical individual. And then it says this, verse 11. It set itself up, this individual, this king that emerges. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Let me just repeat that. The Lord's sanctuary will be thrown down. The Antichrist doesn't simply set himself up in the temple of God. He will destroy the temple. The scriptures repeatedly talk about him saying blasphemous things against the God of gods. So listen, this is the Apostles' Bible. right here. When Paul the Apostle in 2 Thessalonians talks about the Antichrist sitting himself or sitting in the temple of God, and then it says proclaiming himself as God, Christians only read that, and they automatically picture him sitting in the throne of God, sitting in the temple, saying, I am Yahweh, I am God, I'm the God of the Bible. But that's impossible, and Paul knew that because Paul was well familiar with the writings of Daniel. And this very verse, that the little horn will set himself up to be as great as the commander of the host, and then, causing the temple to actually be thrown down, taking away the daily sacrifice. These are the very verses, as well as verses in Daniel chapter 11, that Paul was expounding upon. The Antichrist doesn't sit in the temple claiming to be the God of the temple. He does so to mock the God of the temple, claiming to be superior to the God of the temple. This is so essential that we understand the context of 2 Thessalonians 2. Likewise, when John the Apostle in 1 John, did I say John the Apostle? When John in 1 John 2:22 talks about the theology of the Antichrist. He says he denies the Father. He denies the Son. He's not just making this information up out of the blue. He is expounding upon Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 38, which give us the theology of the Antichrist. And so we need to remember the apostles had a Bible, and it's called the Old Testament, and it's the foundation for the New Testament. And the New Testament is important. We need to understand it, but we need to understand the passages that they were expounding upon. Likewise, in the book of Revelation, it's just expanding upon the book of Daniel. But it's important to point out, a lot of people miss the fact that the temple, the sanctuary, will be destroyed by the Antichrist. He will trample it underfoot for 3.5 years, the scriptures say. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. Now, other translations, again, this is the NIV, say the host. Now, that is the leaders of Israel. So previously, the starry host are the inhabitants of heaven, but then here the host are the leaders of Israel. So because of rebellion, the leaders of Israel and the people of Israel will be, and the daily sacrifice and the temple will be given over to, again, the little horn, the Antichrist. It prospered in everything it did, and truth is thrown to the ground. Again, I always have to make the joke. People ask me, they say, Joel, do you believe in the prosperity gospel? And I say, oh, absolutely. Again, it says right here in Daniel that the Antichrist will prosper in all he does. This is how we ended the last session, and this is repeated throughout the scriptures. The Lord has chosen to allow the Antichrist to prosper. He can't prosper apart from the will of the Lord, apart from the permissive will of the Lord. Nothing happens in this age without passing through the filter of God's sovereignty. And when he prospers, that means we don't prosper. When he prospers, that means we will be crucified. We will be slaughtered. Okay? And this is according to the permissive will of the Lord. The Lord has chosen to allow his people, his body, his saints to be turned over to the beast, to be turned over to the Antichrist, the persecution, the rage of Satan, in order that we can imitate Jesus and bear witness, and in order that we will, with Jesus, come back to crush Satan and his followers, his seed, under our feet. We will actually participate with Jesus in that. That's a whole nother issue. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, okay, so I'm going to leave that. This is the portion about the 2,300 evenings and mornings. Dalton's going to really hit on that. Now again, verse 15, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me was someone who looked like a man. I love this. Verse 16, and I heard a man's voice from the Ulai canal calling out. One angel calls to the other one, and he says, Gabriel, give this man understanding of the vision. Gabriel, the archangel, the messenger angel, the one that appeared to Mary. Here's Gabriel. Gabriel is present. Gabriel is about to explain, again, the messenger angel from the throne of God is here to explain the meaning of the vision. As he came near to the place I was standing, I was terrified, and I fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. The first words out of his mouth, Daniel, son of man. Now notice, by the way, we talked about Jesus being the Son of Man. Daniel chapter 8 is where the book of Daniel is now given to us in Hebrew. Previously, most of, up until chapter 7, not all of it, but most of it is Aramaic. But from here forward, it's in Hebrew. And so when he calls Daniel here the Son of Man, it's Hebrew, it's Ben Adam. The only place in the Bible that would have been Aramaic, Bar Anasha, would have been Daniel 7. And again, as I pointed out, that's what Jesus referred to himself as, Bar Anasha. How do we know he used the Aramaic? Because when he called himself the Son of Man, it wouldn't have been offensive if he was just saying, I'm a son of Adam, I'm a human. No, he called himself Bar Anasha. I am the divine one. I am the cloud rider of Daniel 7. I am the one who will be given a kingdom and authority and dominions, and my kingdom will never end. I am Yahweh God Almighty. That's what he was saying. And how do we know that? Because when he said it, they accused him of blasphemy, they tortured him, they mutilated him, and they crucified him. And the same thing ultimately happened to Stephen when he used the same term. He is the Bar Anasha. Behold, I see him at the right hand of God. And at that, they put their hands over their ears and they stoned him to death, right? So this is a different expression here. Son of man, he says, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. The first statement from Gabriel's mouth, the vision is about the end times. Do you want to understand the context of the vision? It's about the end times. Daniel then passes out, basically, falls into a deep sleep. Gabriel picks him up, and then he reiterates. He picks up right where he left off. He says this, verse 19, I am going to tell you what will happen in the latter, that will happen later in the time of wrath, or the period of indignation, the final period of indignation, as it says in the NASB, which is what I usually use. Because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. 2 sentences. 3 times Gabriel says the vision is about the end times. It's about the latter days, the end times, the appointed time of wrath, the final period of indignation. He reiterates it 3 times, guys. Gabriel wants us to understand the context. This is not historical. This is not just history. This pertains to the last days. And then he said, the 2-horned ram, so now he begins to give the interpretation. The 2-horned ram represents the kings of Medo-Persia, of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. Now, I always have to point out here an interesting fact. In all English translations, it will say Greece. The Hebrew word there is not Greece, it's Yavan. At the time that the book of Daniel was written, 5th century BC, Yavan didn't mean Greece because Greece really didn't even exist yet. It referred to the regions of the western coastlands of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, as well as what we would consider the coastlands of Greece. So that whole area, that basin around the Mediterranean, western Asia Minor, western Turkey, and then Thessaloniki and some of the Greek islands and so forth, right? That's what it meant in Daniel's day. It didn't mean Greece. It's kind of an anachronism to then impose Greece backwards. And it's actually partially due to this pervasive prejudice that really dominates the field of academia, that Daniel was actually not written by the real Daniel. There's a little bit of a creeping prejudice that comes out. It should just say Yavan, and we could look it up what it's referring to, because again, Greece didn't exist yet in Daniel's day, and that's an important point. So he says that the unicorn goat that comes from the west, he's coming from the region of western Turkey and Greece. Again, that's the same area, Macedonia, that Alexander the Great was the first king of, so to speak, the son of Philip. But we have to recognize that it's Turkey, not just Greece. Okay? The large horn between its eyes is the first king. Verse 22, the 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. Now here it moves forward into history. And it says, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked. Now here again, it's Gabriel is giving the interpretation. He's zeroing in on the little horn. He says, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will be satanically empowered. He will cause astounding devastation. And again, what does it say here? He will succeed in whatever he does. He will prosper. He will destroy those who are mighty and the holy people. He will destroy the holy people. Again, the Lord will allow that. He will cause deceit to prosper. He will consider himself superior. This is the essence of the arrogant king, the boastful king. He considers himself superior to every god. Although, as it says in Daniel 11, he has a God. He has a God that he honors, a God of forces, a God of fortresses, a God of war, a God of jihad. He doesn't just worship concepts. He has a God. That's very important. When they feel secure, so the holy people, when they have a false sense of security, he will destroy many. He will take his stand against the Prince of Princes. There it again, it reiterates that he will exalt himself even to be equal to the commander of the host. He will take his stand against, who's the Prince of Princes? Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power, right? Because the Messiah comes back. You take your stand against the Prince of Princes, the King of Kings, and justice is coming for you. And then it wraps up. The vision of the evenings and mornings is true. Again, we'll let Dalton address that. Finally, verse 27, I, Daniel, was worn out. I was exhausted for several days after he had this vision. And then I got up and I went about the king's business. That's why it seems as though he was there in Babylon. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. And I can relate to that. I can relate to that because I have agonized. I have agonized over this chapter. Now, we've read the whole thing. We've read Gabriel's explanation. Now, when I wrote my book, Mideast Beast, I took the traditional classic interpretation, which is to say this, that when you have the vision at the beginning, verses 3 through, let me make sure I get this right, verses 3 through 8, okay, verses 3 through 8, which concern the ram, the goat, the prominent horn on the goat, which breaks off, and then the four horns that come up, and then even the little horn, that part is all historical. Okay, the classic traditional interpretation. If you scan a broad range of conservative, evangelical, futurist, believing commentaries, overwhelmingly, they're going to take the traditional classic interpretation, which is that verses 3 through 8, the part about the ram and the goat and the four horns, that pertains to history. That part of the prophecy is historical. But from verses 9 through 12, the part about the little horn, that kind of has dual meaning. It concerns Antiochus Epiphanes, and then Antiochus Epiphanes is a type or a foreshadow of the Antichrist. He's a prototype. In fact, he is arguably the single greatest, not arguably, he is the single greatest prototype of the Antichrist in all of Scripture. Okay, so the classic interpretation is that the two-horned ram, again, as Gabriel says, represents the kings of Media and Persia, that was the Medo-Persian expansion throughout the whole region, that it came from, again, the regions of modern-day Iran today, you could say up in Kurdistan as well, up in the north, where the Medes would have been from, and together they spread out across all of Iraq and Syria, up into Turkey, all the way up into Europe, in fact. And it was a massive success. But then came the goat from the west, and they say that was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. And the goat is the kingdom, but the prominent horn is Alexander the Great. Okay? And so then after he died at the height of his power, which is exactly what it says, that prominent horn is broken off, he died, and then four horns came up in his place. Now again, the commentaries will say this is the Diadochi, which is Greek for the successors. Alexander's successors. Okay, and almost universally, we'll get to this, they say it's Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Okay, those four. In most, I say universally, modern commentaries. Again, we're going to get to that. But then, later, out of the Seleucid or Seleucid dynasty came Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was a bad guy. He invaded the land of Israel. It records his career, his cruelty in the book of Maccabees, the extra-biblical or the apocryphal book of Maccabees that's in the Catholic Bible. It tells the story, and he was a brutal guy. He made Judaism illegal. He made observing Torah illegal. He tried to force the Jews to embrace the pagan Greek practices and so forth. He slaughtered over 40,000 inhabitants of Jerusalem, and he exiled another 40,000. He was a bad, bad guy. He is a prototype of the Antichrist. Okay, that is the traditional classic interpretation. So it begins with history, events that have already been taken place, already been fulfilled in history, but then it bleeds into the last days. That is again, the traditional interpretation. I'm going to say, 6-7 years ago, I'm not sure how long it's been, I started dialoguing with Mark Davidson. I mentioned him in the first class. He wrote the book Daniel Revisited. And Mark holds that Daniel 7, the four beasts of Daniel 7 are all end-time kingdoms that exist on the earth at the same time. So he has this futurist interpretation of Daniel 7. Well, he has the same thing with regard to Daniel 8. And so in dialoguing with Mark, I thought he made some great points. I thought he hit on some very important points. And again, my attitude toward prophecy is I don't have a position. I don't have a bone to pick. I don't want to just choose a position and hold firm. I want to be humble. I want to be open. If there's something there, I want to pay attention to it. If someone comes along and says, yeah, but what about this verse? What about this? I go, that's valid. I don't want just the traditional interpretation says this, and tradition's great when it preserves truth. When it preserves error and it becomes calcified, it needs to be challenged, okay? So 5 years ago, give a little backstory. 5 years ago, for the first time ever, I won't say I was convinced by Mark, but I was convinced that he made some really valid points. And at times I probably would say that I've been convinced. I've been right on the line to say I'm kind of convinced. The case for this futurist interpretation of Daniel 8 is pretty significant, but I've always said, but I want to be careful. I want to be cautious. If this next thing happens, then we need to pay attention, right? So what are the primary reasons for the futurist interpretation? Again, that not just the little horn, that's not the only part that pertains to the end times, but that all of the prophecy has end time eschatological implications. Whether we're talking about the two-horned ram, or the goat, or the four horns, or the little horn. All of it, verses 3 all the way to 12, the whole vision is pertaining to the end times. Well, first of all, let's just start with Antiochus Epiphanes. Let's just start with verses 9 through 12, just to establish the fact that it does have to do with the end times, that it was not fulfilled in history with Antiochus, that it ultimately, at least the latter part of the prophecy, definitely pertains to the end times. Well, how do we know that? Well, again, it talks about this horn growing up and causing the stars of heaven to fall down. Well, that event, that specific event, is actually referenced later in Revelation. In fact, I think it's important that we read those verses. Revelation 12, 3 and 4, and then I'm going to skip forward to verse 9. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 crowns. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Now again, these are angels. And who is this dragon? The dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And then this cry rises up. Now the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah, Christ, have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down. Now notice, Satan today, presently, has access to the throne of God as the accuser of the brethren. This event is yet future. This is talking about the time when Satan will finally be cast out of heaven. And then it says this, for this reason, rejoice, O you heavens, because he's been cast out. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. What's that short time? 3.5 years. So there is a seminal spiritual event that the scriptures say will take place in the last days. Satan will be cast out of the heavens, along with a third of his angels. Satan's angels, fallen, rebellious principalities, angels, whatever, they come down with him, and all hell will break loose on the earth. And that is when the Antichrist is revealed. That is when he finally reveals himself, and he sets himself up in the temple of God. That is when the abomination of desolation takes place, and that is when the temple will ultimately be destroyed. That final 3.5 years, that short time, 42 months, this is the great tribulation. This is the time of Jacob's trouble. This is the time of ultimate testing for the people of God, okay? But this is an event that happens in the future. This is not history, okay? But Revelation 12 is drawing from what? Daniel 8. Daniel 8. It will cause the stars to fall down, and all that language is then expanded upon here in Revelation. Okay, so first of all, we know Antiochus didn't do that. He couldn't do that. The Antichrist will do that. So that's the first reason to say the prophecy is about the end times. The second reason is because Gabriel said so. 3 times, over and over again, Gabriel said, it's about the end times, it's about the end times, it's about the end times. Now, when I've talked about this, I've said, guys, notice that Gabriel never says, Daniel, I'm about to give you understanding of the vision. Verses 3 through 8 pertain to history, but verses 9 through 12 pertain to he just says the vision is about the end times, the end times, the end times. He says it over and over again. And so as I was in dialogue, again, with Mark Davidson several years ago, I started looking at the words of Gabriel and going, he doesn't qualify it at all. And so I said, this is something that this consistent futurist interpretation, it needs to be looked at with sincerity. Okay, so that was the main issue. Now, stepping back, what were some of the reasons that I came to be really pretty close to convinced, if not convinced, that the prophecy concerns the last days? Well, one of the biggies, in fact, probably the biggie, is the fact that when I started doing research, okay, I started studying, I started working through the history of the aftermath after Alexander died. Started working through, just secular historical books that detail that time in history. What I found is that after Alexander died, well, let me just say this. What I found is that it's an incredibly complicated 50 years after Alexander died. There was a lot of intrigue, a lot of dynasties, a lot of all kinds of things. It's a very complicated period of history to try to wrap your head around. All the different names. Again, most Christians, they hear, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Antipater, all these different names, Philip, Demetrius. And so I started working through these, and what I found shocked me. Because every commentary that you read will say, clearly the 4 horns represent the 4 Diadochi, the 4 successors. After Alexander died, they say 4 generals took over and fought and divided up his kingdom into 4. Make it sound really simple. And we just take their word for it. We just take their word for it. But that's not how it happened. That is not how it happened. That's not what happened. What actually happened is very complicated, and it would take probably too long to really work through it all. But essentially, Alexander died. I'll try to keep it real simple. Alexander died, and his wife, Roxana, I don't know if she was his wife or girlfriend, but Roxana was pregnant with Alexander's child. Alexander also had a brother named Philip, named after their father. And most historians say that Philip probably was slow. Let's just put it that way. A little mentally deficient. And so the regents, the temporary rulers, so to speak, they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Alexander died. We'll wait to see when this child is born to Roxana. If it's a male, then we're going to split the kingdom up between the unborn child of Roxana and Philip. And until then, we will be the co-regents. We'll kind of just, steer the thing forward until the time when these, the rightful heirs of Alexander, can take the kingdom. Well, of course, it wasn't long. And then in the meantime, what they did is they divided up Alexander's kingdom into provinces, satraps or satrapies. Basically, that's just a Persian term. I don't know, all the books will say satrapies, just say provinces. 23 to 26 provinces. So really, if we want to, and each one of those is governed by its own governor, so to speak. So really, if we want to be specific, after Alexander died, 26 horns came up. But very quickly, there was all kinds of intrigue. And again, different people start getting killed, and there's all sorts of shuffling for places of power. And after several years, the Diadochi emerged. The Diadochi emerged. But the problem is there were not 4. There were 5. There were 5. There was not just Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. There was also Antigonus. And Antigonus the One-Eyed. This guy is a great historical character. In Greek, his name is Antigonus Monophthalmus, which just means the one-eyed. But it's great. Hey, Monophthalmus. So he's not a cyclops, okay? He was blind in one eye. And I always liken him to the John Wayne or Jeff Bridges character in True Grit, okay? Antigonus. And what does it say right here? The greatest of the successors. He was the greatest. He was blind in one eye. He was at least 20 some odd years older than all of the other guys. He was overweight. He was really overweight. And he ran strategic circles around these other guys. He was the seasoned veteran that came the closest to ultimately consolidating and taking over all of Alexander's previous dominion. And actually, I love the name of this book, Ghost on the Throne. It's a clever title because what this author is trying to hit on is that all of these successors, all of these guys that were clamoring for control, everyone was trying to live up to the legend of Alexander, the ghost on the throne. This mythical, unattainable, everyone was trying to reproduce what Alexander had done. The guy that came the closest was Antigonus. Okay, so anyway, I look at this and I go, the scriptures clearly say 4. And I go, the scriptures they're precise. It's not just 4, 5, who cares? So for the reason that Gabriel just unqualified said it's about the end times, and then I started seeing some potential problems with the events of history. And so I've been presenting this again for 5 years, and I've offered it with caution. I mean, I hope that I've always offered it with caution. I've really made efforts to do so. But the implications of that would be absolutely dramatic. If this chapter is understood as all end times, again, that basically what that means is that Iran is going to invade the whole Middle East in the last days. And then there would be a Turkish response, a clash between Iran and Turkey. And what's amazing, by the way, because we use the terms Iran and Turkey, is elsewhere in the book of Daniel, right, it talks about, in Daniel chapter 10, it talks about the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece, right, the principalities. These are these powerful heavenly beings that govern these parts of the world. And, they're at war, they're at conflict. And so you look at history, you had the clash between the Medes and the Persians and Alexander the Great, boom. And then later in history, you have the Parthians and the Romans, right? They're clashing and they're banging heads. Then you had the Sassanids and the Byzantines. Then you had the Safavids and the Ottomans. Today you have Iran and Turkey. This part of the world, they've been banging heads. These geographic parts of the world have been clashing at the Euphrates for thousands of years. And it's more than just geography, that these parts of the world naturally are inclined to be in conflict. It also pertains to the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. There are spiritual principles at work here, ancient principles that cause these parts of the world. So it wouldn't surprise us at all if there would be some kind of an end times clash between Iran and Turkey. That shouldn't be surprising. But if the consistent futurist interpretation is true, that has dramatic implications. That would mean that we could look out and virtually count down the steps to the emergence of the Antichrist. After the leader of this Turkish defeat of Iran is successful, that leader would die, and then this new Turkey would break up into four. And out of one of them would come the Antichrist. We could almost watch these events unfold. It would be one of the clearest roadmaps to the emergence of the Antichrist. And that would be profound. And I go, if the book of Daniel is a manual for the end-time church, then this could be one of the most specific, detailed prophecies. Okay, now I'm gonna throw out the real M. Night Shyamalan twist. Since I did the first class with Maranatha Global Bible Study, I ended it by saying, I'm really struggling, if I'm to be honest, guys. I've always really struggled with the fact that the third beast in Daniel 7 is, that I say is Greece, that, virtually every commentary identifies as Greece, this leopard. It has 4 heads and 4 wings. Because I'm over here saying, but wait a minute, my studies say that Alexander's kingdom was not really broken up into 4. Based on my reading, then how is it that Alexander's kingdom is represented by 4 back here in Daniel 7? How is that? And so I go, that bothers me. That almost lends toward the idea that maybe Daniel 7 should be understood as future as well. And so over the past couple of weeks, I've been agonizing. And again, I always have to point this out. I don't know, maybe I'm bragging. But I've got like 200 commentaries on the book of Daniel. It's almost like I collect them. But I do read them. I mean, I work through them. And some of them I don't read because they're written by unbelievers. But I've been agonizing. I've been poring through this issue. It's something that I've put on the shelf in a lot of ways for the past 5 years. Because I got to a point where I banged my head and I just said, I don't know how to reconcile some of these things. I don't know how to do it. But I've been poring through it the past couple of weeks. And here's the announcement. And this is going to drive people crazy. I actually have come to a place where I think that everything that I just presented to you, I actually think the original, classic, traditional interpretation actually has more merit. And the position that I argue for, again, in my book, Mideast Beast, the traditional, classic interpretation actually has more merit than the futurist interpretation that I've been presenting for the past 5 years. I'm not ruling it out completely. I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is, we have to acknowledge that the Bible presents Alexander's Greek kingdom, the fallout after Alexander died. It presents it using the language of toward the 4 winds of heaven. It was parceled out into 4. Even though, it was not really 4 but 5. And these guys fought for like 23 years after Alexander died, finally in the Battle of Ipsus. That's when Antigonus got killed. And he was in his 80s. Antigonus was in his 80s when he finally died, the Battle of Ipsus. He took a spear, Can you imagine, that's just a bad guy. But anyway, he was an awesome general, an awesome soldier. He finally died, but by the way, his son Demetrius took over. So there was still 5. But here's the thing, is I want to return to the statements within the text. Verse 8, this is the vision. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. And again, we highlighted this, but let's do it again. In its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Notice that language. Now again, back in Daniel 7, which we've already highlighted, back in Daniel 7, it talks about the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. And again, I argued for, and I think really, in my opinion, the only, I don't say the only position, but to me, I am thoroughly convinced that Daniel 7 is talking about historical kingdoms, that it aligns with Daniel 2, that it's Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then ultimately the Islamic Empire. Not the Roman Empire, but the Islamic Empire, the Middle Eastern empire, the historical Middle Eastern empire that will be revived. Okay, here in Daniel 7, there in Daniel 7, it's the horns grow up in verse 27 out of the beast. Okay, but the leopard is Greece, and so it's portrayed there as having 4 heads and 4 wings. Then here, and again, guys, Daniel is ultimately reiterating the same points. It's always merging at that same time period, the final period before the return of Jesus. But now get this. When we turn to Daniel chapter 11, we have a very similar statement, beginning in verse 2. Now I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Yavan, again, the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, there's almost no one that will argue that this is yet future, because the details that emerge in verses 2 up to 21 there's so many details. If you really work through it carefully, it is minimum of 1 or 2 generations. Minimum. So in other words, if someone tries to say all of this has end time application, all of it has future application, then that would mean they would have to believe that Jesus is not going to return for at least another 40 years. Even if you squeezed it down to another 30 years, there's a lot of events that unfold here in Daniel 11. Pretty much everyone acknowledges that Daniel 11 begins with history, but then it bleeds into, again, through that person of Antiochus, it bleeds into the end times. And there's a period of transition in chapter 11. Again, Dalton's going to work through this portion. That in the life of Antiochus, it bleeds from his life, and all of a sudden it's just talking about the Antichrist. And here's what's interesting is that, and I'm not going to look it up right now, but it says right here in the same thing, it says the vision is about the end times. It says that what is about to be explained here pertains to the last days. And yet it begins in history and it bleeds into the last days. So how can we say that chapter 8 can't do that? And again, Gabriel doesn't use the language of it bleeding, but yet everyone acknowledges that that's what takes place here. And so again, if we're consistent, we have to say that the traditional position that it begins with history, chapter 8, and then bleeds into the last days, that view is certainly a valid option. We have to say that. But notice again the language here. When it talks about Alexander, let me just read it again. His empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power that he exercised. Again, back here in chapter 8, in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward it uses the exact same language, the 4 winds of heaven. And then down in the interpretation in verse 22, the 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation. And then it says the same thing, but will not have as much power as him. Daniel 8, Daniel 11 say the same thing. They say the same thing. Daniel 7 says the same thing. It uses the number of 4 to refer to the successors of Alexander. And so ultimately, I really feel as though the traditional interpretation, despite the fact that for the past 5 years I've been arguing, I think, pretty effectively for the consistent futurist interpretation, I think the traditional classic interpretation probably has more merit. Does it bother me? Does it bother me that when you really look at the events of that unfolded after Alexander died, that there were really not 4, there were 5? It kind of does. However, as I've been working through all of these books, this is a newer one that I just got this year, and I was working through this. And what this guy does, this is Antipater's dynasty. He just focuses in on one of the dynasties. As I said, guys, this whole period of history after Alexander died, it's incredibly complex. Like when you try to draw a chart of the different successors, these dynasties, it's so complicated because one dynasty will have, the family line, the family tree, and then they intermarry with one of the other ones. And so the charts are they're kind of chaotic. They really are, and that whole period's chaotic. So how do you quantify? Is it 4? Is it 5? What this guy, John Granger, does is he highlighted something, and it stuck out to me. He said after Alexander died, again, during this whole period of intrigue, there were 4 families. 4 families that were the primary inheritors of Alexander's kingdom. Now, one of the dynasties had a division, and out of that division came 2 of the previous names that I've mentioned, Seleucus and Antigonus. So I've been looking at it going, there were 4 major generals. There were 5 major generals, not 4. And I go, so it doesn't fit. History doesn't fit with the 4, and I believe the Bible is precise, and this bothers me. Until I said, well, there is the reality that there were 4 primary families, 4 primary dynasties, and in all of this chaos, one of these dynasties split, and so in a sense you could say there were 5 horns, but the way the Bible has chosen to speak to that period of history is to use the number 4. And to a degree, it's an expression toward the 4 winds of heaven. Some translations will just say toward the 4 points of the compass. It's basically just saying, look, guys, after Alexander died, it gets divided up, and it chooses to use the number 4. And I don't think it's about being precise in terms, because the reality is, yes, there were 5 major divisions, but there were actually a handful of other smaller little provinces and fiefdoms as well. And so if we really want to be specific, we can get really ridiculous. And I don't think that's the purpose. I don't think that's the purpose, that God's purpose there is to be scientifically precise. It's conveying this theme that after Alexander died, this great king, that it would be divided up. Okay, so with that said, what are the implications? What is Daniel 8 telling us? Well, what that means is that, again, you had the Medo-Persian expansion throughout the Middle East. Later, you had Alexander's response. He defeated the Medo-Persian Empire. He died. His kingdom was broken up. And out of one of those comes the Antichrist. Which one? It's the Seleucid dynasty, or the Seleucid dynasty. Because Antiochus Epiphanes was the 8th king that came out of that dynasty. So what Daniel does is it identifies the dynasty, the regions that the Antichrist would come from. But here's the thing. If the traditional classic interpretation is true, then we're not looking for necessarily some regional Iranian invasion. That doesn't have to happen. There doesn't have to be all these series of wars. The next major thing to happen, according to Daniel 8, is the Antichrist is going to emerge out of, as a little horn. He starts small and he grows up great, out of the Seleucid dynasty. And again, throughout the whole history of the Seleucid dynasty, it was changing, and its borders were always moving, and they're in conflict constantly for 30 years after Alexander died. But basically, we're dealing with the regions of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, that whole northern swath of the Middle East, right? So it's basically pointing to the same general regions as all of the other prophets, as Ezekiel, Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. That's Asia Minor. That's Turkey. Micah, Isaiah refer to the Antichrist as the Assyrian, from the region of the former Assyrian Empire. He's referred to as the Chaldean in Nahum. Okay, so ultimately, we've got these 2 different interpretive options. I'm saying I think the classic, so I started out with one position. For about 5 years have been teaching an alternative position, and now I finally come to the place where I've said, I think my answers have been met, and I actually think the traditional interpretation is probably the better option. I think it better reconciles the totality of the different visions in Daniel's book. And what that means is there's not a major significant sign that we have to look for until the emergence of the Antichrist. And it could be a lot closer. It could be a lot closer than any one of us think. And so that's my takeaway. I hope that you all appreciate my transparency with y'all. And listen, some people will be frustrated, like, wait, you taught this. Look, I want to be submissive to the Word of God. I'm not out to try to defend any particular position of mine. I want to humbly submit to the Word of God, and I want to agonize and work through it. And that includes working through historical stuff, at times. But we have to submit to the Word of God. It's not about championing some particular theory or idea or anything like that. We want to just be submissive to the Word of God and let the chips fall where they may, and keep our eyes open and remain humble and flexible. Amen. All right, guys, that's it for now. We'll see you. Dalton's going to take over for a few lessons, and then we'll see you back here soon. Until then, God bless y'all. Maranatha.